Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating and, honestly, pretty widely misunderstood world of how we actually measure language learning. I mean, think about it. Getting these measurements right dictates so much of our lives. Who gets into college, who lands that dream job, and even how our educational systems are built. The architecture behind these measurements is absolutely eye-opening. We're going to break down the exact definitions, trace the history of how we got here, and take a hard look at the future of language evaluation. Let's get into it.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining what we call the big three concepts. Then we'll compare their key differences, walk through the historical evolution of how these methods developed, check out some modern alternatives, and wrap up with some really important critical perspectives. Okay, starting off with defining the big three. We need to clarify three terms that get thrown around interchangeably all the time by educators, but they are actually very distinct.
Think about your own time in school for a second. You've definitely experienced all three of these things. But do you know the precise difference between taking a test, undergoing an assessment, and getting an evaluation? Knowing the distinction here is literally the foundation for effective teaching.
Let's start with the narrowest one. Testing. Drawing on the work of Arthur Hughes from our source material, a test is a highly formal procedure. It's built specifically to measure your ability, knowledge, or performance in a very specific domain. And the key here is that it happens under strictly controlled conditions. It's an event. It happens at a specific time, uses formal instruments, and almost always spits out a hard numerical score or a letter grade.
To put that into perspective with some everyday examples, testing is exactly what you picture when you hear the word. It's those traditional classroom exams, unexpected pop quizzes, and of course, massive high-stakes standardized tests like the IELTS or the TOEFL. You sit down in a quiet room, you answer questions while a clock ticks down, and you walk out with a number that supposedly represents your ability right at that very second.
Now, zooming out a bit, we get to assessment. Drawing on H. Douglas Brown, assessment is much more of an ongoing continuous loop. It covers a way wider domain than just a one-off test. It's the continuous process of gathering information about a learner's progress, their unique needs, and their overall achievements over time. So unlike a test that just gives you a grade, assessment is all about giving constructive feedback so you can actually improve the learning process as it's happening.
So what does this continuous gathering of info look like? Well, it's varied. It could be a teacher simply observing your confidence while you're giving a presentation, or looking at the creativity you've poured into a semester-long portfolio, or even just checking your daily homework assignments. Notice how none of these happen in a strict, silent vacuum? They all work together to build a comprehensive, living picture of a student over time.
As zooming out even further to the absolute highest macro level, we hit evaluation. Evaluation is completely decision-oriented. It's the process where you take all that rich assessment data and you use it to make big-picture final judgments. And we're not just talking about judging learners here. Evaluation judges the effectiveness of entire educational programs, the curricula being used, and yes, even the teaching methods themselves.
Because evaluation is about passing judgment, it almost always leads to a major action. We're talking about deciding definitively whether a student passes or fails a course. It's administrators evaluating whether their teaching staff is actually effective, or making the huge call to completely revise a school's curriculum, or measuring the success of a university as a whole. It's the final destination where all the collected data is ultimately judged.
Let's look at how these compare when we put them right next to each other. Breaking this down across 4 dimensions makes the contrast super clear. In terms of scope, testing is incredibly narrow, assessment is broad, and evaluation is the absolute broadest. Time-wise, a test is a specific event, assessment is a continuous everyday process, and evaluation usually happens at the very end. But the real kicker is their purpose and outcome. Testing is about assigning a rigid score. Assessment is about providing feedback to help you learn, and evaluation is about making a final judgment or decision.
So the big takeaway here is that these aren't isolated ideas. They are like Russian nesting dolls. They're heavily interconnected. Testing is literally just one small component of the larger assessment process, and that continuous loop of assessment generates the massive amount of information needed to actually perform a proper evaluation. You really need a balanced mix of all three for a healthy educational system.
Okay, let's pivot to the historical evolution of language testing. Understanding where we are means looking back at the paradigm shifts that got us here. And spoiler alert, the history of testing is pretty much a mirror image of how language teaching methodologies evolved over the decades. We can track this journey through 4 distinct historical eras.
And what's fascinating is that each new era introduces a fresh testing philosophy specifically designed to fix the glaring flaws of whatever method came right before it. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we had the essay translation period. This was the era of the grammar translation method. Tests back then heavily focused on rote memorization of grammar rules, strict translation tasks, and literary interpretation. The massive flaw here, as Arthur Hughes pointed out, was wild subjectivity. Literally, picture a teacher grading your essay based entirely on their mood that afternoon. There was zero statistical reliability, no consistency, and definitely no objective scoring.
So, to fix that subjectivity, a massive pivot happened between the 1940s and 60s. Welcome to the structuralist and psychometric era. Driven by behaviorist psychology and championed by folks like Robert Lotto, testing became highly scientific. Language was broken down into tiny, separate pieces. You'd be tested purely on your ability to pick the correct verb tense in one single isolated sentence, a method called discrete point testing. This is the era that gifted us the multiple-choice format. It allowed for huge scale and perfect statistical reliability. But critics quickly realized that testing isolated grammar points entirely ignores how human beings actually speak and interact in the real world.
Reacting to how robotic multiple-choice tests felt, the 1970s ushered in the integrative testing period. Scholars like John Aller stepped up and said, hey, language isn't just a pile of isolated parts, it's an integrated system. They argued for holistic measurement. This brought in things like dictation exercises, composition writing, and cloze tests. If you've never heard of a cloze test, it's where you get a paragraph with words blanked out and you have to fill them in based on context. It forces you to use vocabulary, grammar, and reading comprehension all at the exact same time.
Finally, from the late 1970s on, heavily influenced by Del Heim's concept of communicative competence, we arrived at communicative language testing. This completely flipped the script. Lyle Bachman and others argued we shouldn't just test what you know about a language, we need to test if you can actually use it in a realistic setting. So testing shifted to real-world tasks. Can you hold your own in a spontaneous conversation? Can you write a professional email? Can you stand up and give a clear presentation? Fluency and functional ability became the gold standard.
So bringing all of this into the modern day, let's look at alternative, performance-based assessments.
Today, education is all about authentic performance and learner autonomy. We're seeing tons of peer assessment, self-reflection, and portfolio work. But the real game changer? Technology. We now use adaptive computer testing, where the test literally gets harder or easier in real time depending on whether you get the previous question right. We're integrating AI-supported evaluation for instant feedback, and we use global frameworks like the CEFR to map out exactly what a learner can do in real-world scenarios.
Before we wrap up, we absolutely have to look at this through a critical lens. It's so important to analyze both the benefits and the blind spots of how we test today.
The biggest conceptual shift in modern education is a move away from traditional exams that just promote memorization. Educators are pushing for a massive paradigm shift, moving from merely doing an assessment of learning, meaning just checking a box at the end of the year to see what you remember, to assessment for learning. This means using assessments formatively. It's about giving you continuous feedback to help you identify your weak spots and actually improve while the learning is still happening.
And this shift is so necessary because traditional high-stakes testing has some huge downsides. H. Douglas Brown hit the nail on the head back in 2004 when he warned that an excessive reliance on formal testing may reduce learning to teaching to the test. High-stakes environments cause massive anxiety. They reward short-term rote memorization over actual, authentic communication. When the only goal is passing the test, real creativity often just gets tossed out the window.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought to leave you with. We know we value authentic, creative human communication. But for the sake of practicality and saving time, we are leaning harder and harder into AI and automated scoring systems. So the big question critics are asking is, even though technology makes testing more accessible and efficient, can a machine ever truly evaluate the depth, the nuance, and the spark of human creativity? Balancing that robotic reliability with genuine human authenticity is without a doubt our biggest ongoing challenge. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how we measure what we learn.